There's a moment that happens to everyone. You say something, maybe too fast, maybe too sharp, and immediately wish you could take it back. But the words are already out there, floating. And now, things have changed. The silence afterward is louder than anything you said. It might cost you a relationship. It might damage your reputation. It might echo for years in the background of conversations, in the corners of memory. Now imagine the opposite. You walk into a room. Everyone notices, but you don't rush to speak. You observe. You let the noise pass through you, and when you finally speak, if you speak at all, it lands like a stone in still water. That is power. And Stoicism has known it for over 2,000 years. In a world where everyone is shouting for attention, silence feels rebellious. And yet, the most powerful people in history didn't dominate with volume. They led with stillness, with restraint, with silence that wasn't weakness, it was control. Marcus Aurelius ruled the greatest empire of his time, and yet his most famous words were never spoken aloud. They were written in his private journal Meditations, addressed not to the world, but to himself. He wasn't trying to impress, he was trying to stay grounded, to master himself before trying to lead anyone else. And that's where this journey begins. Because what if I told you the real reason the most powerful people stay silent is not because they don't know what to say, but because they understand when not to say it. In the next 45 minutes, we're going to unlock the silent code that Stoics lived by. We'll explore the hidden strength in staying quiet, the traps of compulsive speech, and how ancient wisdom can sharpen your voice by teaching you when to withhold it. But this isn't a philosophy lecture. This is a transformation. By the end, you'll walk away with 7 tools, quiet, sharp, and powerful, to make your words matter. To become someone who doesn't just talk, but moves rooms with silence. Let's begin where all noise ends, with the stillness inside. Pause here for 8 seconds of silence, a deep breath. Let the listener feel it. Have you ever watched someone who commands a room without saying anything? Maybe it's a grandparent, someone older sitting in a corner at a family event. They're not trying to impress anyone. But when they finally speak, everyone leans in. That's not charisma, that's gravity. Or maybe it's that friend who rarely posts online, barely texts back, but when they share something, people stop scrolling. Because their silence has trained the world to listen. There's a kind of presence that can't be faked. And in the Stoic worldview, it begins with self-mastery. Not the kind of mastery that's loud and shiny, but the kind that waits, observes, chooses its moment, like a surgeon's blade, or a lion crouching in the tall grass. It's the opposite of what the world teaches. The world says, speak up, say more, post more, be louder. Stoicism says, say only what improves the silence. And if it doesn't, don't. It sounds simple, but the reason most people can't do it is because silence exposes something we're not ready to face. Ourselves, the inner noise, the opinions, the insecurities, the script that plays when we're not being validated. So we fill the space, we speak, we overshare, because silence feels like surrender. But to the Stoic, silence isn't surrender, it's discipline. It's the ultimate act of control, not over others, but over yourself. Here's a story that will stay with you. A man named Joseph in his mid-30s worked in corporate law in Chicago. He was brilliant, confident, respected. But he had one weakness: he talked too much in meetings. Not out of arrogance, but nervous energy. Every idea had to be explained, every comment needed a follow-up. He thought he was showing passion. His team thought he didn't trust them. One afternoon, the company hosted a retreat with a guest speaker. a retired Navy SEAL. The SEAL told a story about missions, high-pressure chaos. And then he said this line: "In the field, the guy who talks the most is usually the least sure of himself." That hit Joseph like a freight train. That night, he decided to try something new. The next morning's meeting, he said almost nothing. He listened, took notes, only spoke when necessary. 2 weeks later, his boss pulled him aside. "You've been different lately," she said, "and calmer, sharper. People are responding." He wasn't doing more, he was doing less, but his presence had grown. Because silence used intentionally makes people lean in. This is the paradox most people miss. The less you say, the more power your words carry, but only if the silence that holds them comes from strength, not fear. And that's what Stoicism teaches. When Epictetus, once a Roman slave, became a philosopher, he didn't gather crowds by shouting. He asked questions, he paused. He made his students uncomfortable with his stillness, because silence isn't just about not speaking, it's about listening deeply without needing to respond. You see, in Stoicism, speech isn't something you owe the world, it's something you offer, wisely, carefully, like gold. You don't scatter it in the street, you place it in the right hands at the right time. This is your first lesson. Silence is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of control. And if you want to live powerfully, you don't need to raise your voice. You need to raise your awareness. Here's a journal prompt to sit with tonight. When was the last time I said something I didn't need to? What would have changed if I had stayed silent instead? Write about it. Don't rush. You might find that some of your biggest regrets were preventable with just a few seconds of stillness. And maybe, just maybe, your future victories will be built in that same space. Stillness. Let me ask you something before we continue. What if listening became your superpower? In part 2, we'll dive into the art of listening, real listening, not the kind where you're just waiting for your turn to talk. We'll explore how silence creates connection, why presence is magnetic, and how the greatest leaders and Stoics don't speak to be heard. They speak because they've listened first. Get ready to meet the version of yourself who doesn't rush to respond, but responds only when it matters most. Let's go deeper. There's something strange that happens when someone really listens to you. Not nods politely, not waits for their turn to speak, but listens, as if your words are the only ones that exist in that moment. It feels like time slows down, like space opens up around you, like you're being seen, not just heard. But how often does that happen? Most conversations today are two monologues colliding. People talk over each other. They answer before the question is even finished. They scroll while you speak, and in the background everyone's just waiting for a pause to jump in and say, "Yeah, that reminds me of my story." That's not listening, that's rehearsing. But here's what Stoicism teaches us. If silence is strength, listening is the weapon that wields it. Because when you truly listen, deliberately, patiently, you're not just gathering information. You're showing discipline. You're demonstrating emotional control. You're practicing presence. Presence that feels rare because it is. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question. What fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize?" That quote isn't just about judgment. It's about awareness. The kind of awareness you can only develop when you're not speaking, when you're paying attention. There's a story I want to tell you. It's simple, but it changed the way I see silence forever. A man named Alan, mid-40s, worked as a crisis counselor. He wasn't flashy, he didn't have a booming voice. He was quiet, almost invisible. New hires thought he lacked authority until they saw what he could do. One day, a young woman came in for counseling. She was grieving. Her brother had died by suicide and she was unraveling. Her parents weren't speaking to each other, her friends didn't know what to say, and she was carrying it all alone. She sat down, eyes puffy, shoulders tight. And Alan? He didn't say a word, he just looked at her. Present. Still. Available. She talked for 20 minutes straight. She cried, vented, broke down, and still he said nothing until she paused and whispered, "I don't know why I'm saying all this." Then he finally spoke. "Because this is the first time someone let you." That's the moment she broke completely. Not because he said something profound, but because he created the space for her to fall apart and feel safe doing it. That is the power of listening. That is the strength of silence with intention. Stoicism isn't about being cold. It's not about retreating from emotion. It's about creating space between stimulus and response. And in that space, we gain clarity. We find power. We give others the room to be seen. And ironically, when you become that kind of listener, people listen to you more. Because you're no longer part of the noise. You're the calm they're desperate for. Here's something you may not know. In ancient Rome, orators were trained in silence before they were ever allowed to speak. They were taught to observe a room, to read emotion, to feel tone. Because before you speak, you need to see. And you can't see anything if you're too busy rehearsing your next line. This week, try something radical. In every conversation, give yourself this simple rule. Ask 2 questions for every 1 opinion. It's harder than it sounds, because we're conditioned to prove, explain, defend. But asking slows you down. It places the focus on the other, and it builds trust in a way that statements never could. You'll notice something else too. People start opening up. Walls drop. And in their story, you start hearing echoes of your own. Because the more deeply we listen to others, the more clearly we hear ourselves. It's strange, isn't it? That the act of stepping back, of choosing not to interrupt, can become a mirror for your own growth. You begin to notice your impatience, the itch to jump in, the fear of being forgotten if you don't speak, the mental script preparing your next brilliant line. And in that noticing, you gain power, not over the conversation, but over your ego. Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." Nature gave us the formula, we just stopped following it. But the Stoic listens differently, not to win, not to respond, to understand, to see beyond words, to detect fear behind the anger, to catch grief hiding behind sarcasm, to feel what isn't being said, because that's what presence is. It's not being physically near, it's being emotionally still. You can sit beside someone for hours and never connect, or sit in silence for 2 minutes and change their life. Here's your practice. For 1 full day in every interaction at home, at work, on calls, practice what's called the 70-30 rule. Let the other person speak 70% of the time. Resist the urge to fill space. When there's silence, leave it. Don't rush in. You'll be amazed what people reveal when you stop trying to manage the conversation. More importantly, you'll feel your own power returning. The less you need to talk, the more others want to hear what you have to say. Because silence builds mystery. It creates space. It becomes its own kind of presence. And presence is unforgettable. Just think of your own life. Who do you admire most? Is it the loudest person in the room? Or the one who says little, but leaves impact? Leaders, friends, mentors, the ones who shape us often aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who knew when to stay quiet. And when they finally spoke, it meant something. Here's a question to reflect on tonight. When was the last time I truly listened without preparing my response? What changed in that moment? Write it down. Sit with it. And as you do, remember, the silence between your thoughts, Abwanan, is often where wisdom lives. We're only just getting started. Because listening is the first layer. The next, controlling your internal storm. In part 3, we'll explore how Stoicism gives you the tools to master your emotions. Choose your words wisely and avoid the trap of speaking from pain. We'll talk about the brain's wiring, the danger of reacting too fast, and how silence can be your greatest ally when emotions rise. You'll meet people who lost everything in a moment of unchecked speech, and those who gained everything by learning to wait. Get ready to confront the part of you that wants to speak before it's ready. Because real freedom begins with restraint. There's a moment, maybe you've felt it, when your chest tightens, your vision narrows, and something inside says, say it, now. You've been insulted, dismissed, overlooked. Or maybe someone you love said the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. And the words come flooding to your mouth like a wave of fire. It feels good. In that instant, righteous. Like you're defending your boundaries, speaking your truth. But then the silence afterward, the fallout, the regret, and you realize what you said may have been honest, but it wasn't wise. That's what Stoicism is here to teach us, not to suppress our emotions, but to pause long enough to ask, is what I'm about to say from clarity or from chaos? Because every word has weight, and when emotions run high, that weight can crush something fragile. Trust, dignity, even love. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this and you will find strength. And one of the most underestimated parts of your mind is your mouth. Not just what it says, but when it says it, why it says it, and whether it needed to say anything at all. Let me take you into a story, one that could belong to any of us. A man named Ruben, mid-50s, was a respected school principal in California. Decades of leadership, calm under pressure. He was the kind of guy who knew every student by name. But one morning during a staff meeting, his district supervisor challenged one of his decisions, publicly, sharply. Ruben snapped. He raised his voice, defended his call, launched into a 5-minute tirade that ended with him walking out of the room. Everyone fell silent. His staff saw not strength, but instability. His supervisor never forgot the reaction. He wasn't fired, but something shifted. Within 6 months, he took early retirement. He later admitted to a friend, "If I'd just breathed, if I'd waited 10 seconds, everything would be different." Just 10 seconds. That's how fast emotion can hijack your future. And the science backs it up. When you feel threatened, physically or emotionally, your brain activates the amygdala. It's your fight or flight center. Heart rate rises, breathing shortens. Logic? Paused. The prefrontal cortex, the part that reasons, considers consequences, gets overridden. In those moments, you're not speaking from self, you're speaking from survival. And survival mode conversations are rarely wise. They don't connect, they don't solve, they destroy. This is why the Stoics trained themselves to pause. Epictetus said, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." In other words, the event didn't create your rage, your interpretation did. The challenge is, you can't interpret clearly when you're emotionally flooded. So how do you change it? How do you stay silent when the storm inside is screaming? let me share something deceptively simple. The 3-second rule. When you feel triggered by a comment, a tone, a memory, pause for 3 full seconds before speaking. That pause is a break in the emotional circuit, a breath, a moment for your rational mind to catch up. It sounds too easy, but it's incredibly powerful because most of the damage done in conversations happens in those first 3 seconds of reaction. And if 3 seconds sounds small, try it in real time. 3 seconds in silence can feel like forever. But in that forever, you might save your peace. Here's a real-world example. A woman named Layla worked in publishing. She had a reputation for being sharp, fast, and direct. But her directness sometimes became criticism, especially in emails. One day, her assistant turned in a report with several errors. Layla was tired, stressed, frustrated. She fired off a blunt email. "This is sloppy. I expected better." What she didn't know, her assistant had just lost a parent. She was holding it together by threads. That email broke something. 2 days later, the assistant quit. No goodbye, just gone. Layla later said, "If I'd waited 5 minutes before sending that email, just 5, I would have written something completely different." And that's the thing. We rarely regret silence. We often regret words said too fast from a place of hurt. So here's a Stoic practice, one used by Abraham Lincoln himself. Write the hot letter, but never send it. When you're angry, write exactly what you want to say, no filter, get it all out. But then don't send it, let it sit. Lincoln used to write scathing letters to his generals when they disappointed him, then tuck them into his desk, labeled "never sent." He knew that expressing anger is healthy, but unleashing it, not always. Because words don't disappear. They echo. They shape how people see you. And sometimes they do damage that no apology can undo. So here's what you can do instead. When you're emotional, anchor yourself. That means pick a physical cue that reminds you to pause. It could be pressing your thumb and forefinger together, touching your watch, breathing out slowly and deliberately. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters that your body learns to respond instead of react. You train yourself to become a still lake in the middle of storms, not cold, not numb, just in control. And when you do speak, when you finally let the words out, they come from depth, not from damage. Because here's the deeper truth Stoicism reveals. You are not your first reaction, that first burst of anger, not your identity, that impulse to lash out, not your power. Your power is what comes after the breath, after the awareness, after the choice. Seneca said, "Stillness, the greatest remedy for anger is delay." And that's not just poetic, it's biological. Delay gives your brain time to re-engage the prefrontal cortex, time to reframe, time to choose. So tonight, ask yourself this journal question. What's one moment where I let emotion speak for me? What would I have said if I had waited? Write it down. Not to punish yourself, but to see how small pauses could have changed everything. That's the Stoic way. Control over self, not suppression, but transformation. Because there's nothing soft about restraint. It's the strongest move there is. Next time you're in a heated moment, pause. Don't respond, breathe, say nothing. You'll feel the storm inside begging for release. Let it pass. When the silence settles, you'll know what to say. And more importantly, you'll know what not to. And maybe that's where the real power lives. But there's another layer to this that many miss. Because even when we speak calmly, sometimes we say too much. Sometimes we give away too much of ourselves, too early to the wrong people. And the consequences aren't immediate, they're subtle, but just as costly. In part 4, we'll explore the art of guarding your words, choosing who deserves access to your thoughts, how to avoid the pain of misplaced vulnerability, and how the Stoics use silence not just to calm storms, but to protect what mattered most. Because sometimes silence isn't just about restraint, it's about armor. There's a kind of silence that isn't about peace or patience, it's about protection. Not from conflict, but from the quiet betrayals that happen when we give too much of ourselves to the wrong people. You've probably felt it. You open up to someone, maybe it's a moment of weakness. Maybe you just needed to say it out loud, and they nod, smile, seem to understand. But later, days, weeks, sometimes even years, that moment gets used against you, thrown back in your face, gossiped, twisted, weaponized. You sit there stunned, thinking, I never should have said anything. But Stoicism would say something even sharper. You didn't lose because you trusted. You lost because you trusted too quickly. Because to a Stoic, silence isn't just about self-mastery. It's a filter, a gate, a line of defense. It says, not everyone gets access to my mind. Not everyone earns my truth. And here's where many people misunderstand silence. They think being open means being honest all the time, with everyone. That guarding your thoughts is being closed off or afraid. But that's not what Stoicism teaches. The Stoics believed in radical truthfulness, yes, but also radical discernment. Epictetus said, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. In other words, let your life show who you are, not your mouth. Because once your words leave your lips, they belong to the world, and not everyone in the world is equipped to carry them. Here's a story that illustrates it perfectly. A man named Darren was starting a small business. He had a dream, a plan, and the skills. But he also had anxiety, deep, gnawing fear about whether he was good enough. One night, over drinks, he opened up to a friend. I don't know if I can actually do this. I feel like I'm pretending. His friend listened, laughed it off, and said, you're overthinking it, man. You've got this. 2 months later, Darren's business hit a rough patch. And guess who shared that insecurity with a potential investor? Not maliciously, just casually, over coffee. I mean, even Darren told me he wasn't sure he could handle it. The deal fell through. The business survived, but the friendship didn't. Because Darren realized something brutal. That moment of honesty wasn't wrong. It was just unprotected. He gave sensitive data to someone who didn't know how to hold it, and that's the danger of misplacing your words. They can be used against you, not by enemies, but by people who simply don't understand the weight of what you shared. So here's the question the Stoics would have us ask. Does this person have the integrity to carry what I am about to give them? And if you're not sure, keep it in, not out of fear, out of wisdom, because silence in this case isn't about hiding, it's about holding. Holding your energy, holding your thoughts, holding your vision until it's strong enough to exist without approval. Marcus Aurelius ruled over millions, but his most intimate thoughts were kept in his journal, not shared in public, not announced to his generals. Why? Because he understood that some things gain strength in solitude and lose power when exposed too early. This applies to dreams, to relationships, to healing, to pain. Some things aren't meant to be shared yet, not because they're shameful, but because they're sacred. In a world obsessed with visibility, Stoicism reminds us not everything real needs to be seen. Not every wound needs to be explained, not every plan needs to be announced. Because the louder you are about your process, the more you invite voices that aren't aligned with your path. You'll hear doubt, You'll hear jealousy, you'll hear projections masked as advice, and suddenly you're questioning yourself not because you failed, but because you opened the door before you finished building the foundation. Here's a metaphor. Imagine your inner life is a house under construction. Would you throw a party inside while the roof is half built? Would you invite strangers to walk through with muddy boots? Of course not. You'd wait, building secure. Then, when it's ready, you'd open the door. Your thoughts deserve the same respect. So here's a practice, one that will change how you speak and who you speak to. The 3 appearance rule. Before you share something personal with someone, ask yourself, have they shown up in joy? Have they shown up in pain? Have they shown up in silence? If they haven't been there for all 3, they haven't earned the full picture. Because some people are great when things are fun. Some show up when you're struggling because they like to rescue. Some are present only when they benefit. But someone who stays with you in silence, when there's nothing to gain, when you're not explaining, when you're just being, that's someone you can trust. Until then, keep building. Let your silence do the filtering. And let me be clear, this isn't about isolation, it's about discernment. You can be warm, kind, open-hearted, and still be selective about your truth. Because words are keys. They unlock parts of you. And if you give out keys too easily, don't be surprised when someone opens a door you weren't ready to show. Seneca wrote, "No one is worthy of your trust who cannot be trusted with your silence." Think about that. Not your secrets, not your explanations, your silence. Because someone who truly sees you won't need you to explain yourself constantly. They'll understand the gaps, they'll read between the pauses, and sometimes the person who understands you best is the one who doesn't interrupt your silence but honors it. Here's your journal prompt for tonight. Who in my life has truly earned my silence? Who has not, and yet I've still given them access? Write it down, be honest, and decide what needs to be reclaimed, because your words are not just sounds, they're signals. And some people are not tuned into the right frequency. The Stoics knew this. They knew that quiet wasn't weakness, it was armor, it was protection. It was clarity in a world that constantly pulls you to overshare. And maybe that's the lesson. Don't let your need to be understood become the reason you're misunderstood. There is strength in letting people wonder, in allowing mystery, in being known, but not fully revealed. Because the self you are becoming, it needs space to grow, and that space is guarded by silence. But this leads us to the final chapter. Because while silence is power, there comes a time when it's not enough to stay quiet. You must act, you must build, you must live in such a way that words become unnecessary. In part 5, we'll explore the legacy of silence, how Stoics turned restraint into impact, how they let their actions speak louder than any speech ever could, and how you can do the same, because at the end of it all, the most powerful voice is the one backed by truth in motion. There's a moment when silence transforms. It's no longer just control, no longer just protection. It becomes something else entirely, something heavier, something unshakable. It becomes gravity. You walk into a room and don't need to speak because your presence already has. You no longer chase validation, defend every opinion, or broadcast every move. Because your life, your actions that have taken over where words used to stand. This is the final form of silence. Not just what you withhold, but what you become when you no longer need to explain. The Stoics knew this. They didn't set out to impress. They didn't scream their values from rooftops. They lived them. And that quiet living, It changed everything. Marcus Aurelius didn't post his meditations, he wrote them for himself. They were private reminders to stay centered in a world that never stops spinning. Seneca didn't tweet out Stoic one-liners. He wrote letters to friends, personal, grounded, reflective. Epictetus didn't start arguments to prove he was wise. He asked questions and let others come to their own answers. They weren't silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because their lives had already spoken. And that's the level we're aiming for. To be so anchored in who you are that you don't need to perform it. Let me tell you a story because it stays with me, and it might stay with you. There was a woman named Hannah. She worked in product design, quiet but consistent, didn't seek attention, didn't chase credit. For years, she built things behind the scenes, polished rough edges, simplified chaos, elevated teams without asking for applause. One day, a younger colleague took credit for a major idea she had proposed months earlier. In a big meeting, with senior executives watching. The room clapped. He smiled. She stayed silent, not because she was weak, because she knew something he didn't. A week later, the project hit a snag. Suddenly, the team needed to dive deeper. Guess who had the blueprints, the iterations, the insight to solve it? Hannah. She didn't say a word. She just opened her laptop, shared what she had quietly refined for months, and saved the project from collapse. The room went silent, this time for a different reason. Not because she demanded respect, because she had earned it. From that day forward, her voice didn't need to raise itself, because her actions echoed louder than anyone else's praise. That is the kind of silence that changes careers, that changes lives. But here's the truth, it's harder. It requires faith. It asks you to believe that you don't need constant validation to prove your worth, that you don't have to shout your plans for them to be real. And this runs completely against modern instinct. We live in a world that says, tell everyone, announce it, get the likes, the buzz, the confirmation. But Stoicism says the opposite. Don't talk about being a good person, be one. Marcus Aurelius. Because when you announce too soon, you give away something sacred, your momentum. The brain releases dopamine not only when we achieve, but when we talk about achieving. So when you share your goals too early, your brain rewards you before you've done anything. And that reward can become a trap. You start confusing visibility with progress, noise with direction, attention with success. But the Stoic knows progress loves quiet, not because it fears criticism, but because it understands that growth needs space, not spotlights. So here's your challenge, the final one. Go silent for 24 hours. Not absolute silence, but strategic. Don't share your opinions unless asked. Don't post your thoughts online. Don't explain your plans to anyone. Just observe. Notice how often you want to speak. Notice what it's really about. Is it connection or control? Is it truth or performance? Then take that energy and redirect it inward. Use the time to do something real, right. Building calls someone you love, clean your space, train your body, finish a thing you've started. And let that doing speak for you. When the 24 hours are over, you'll feel something shift. A strange strength, not loud, not flashy, but deeply rooted. You'll realize that silence isn't empty, it's full of power, of clarity, of direction. It's the language of those who have nothing to prove. So here's your final journal prompt. Sit with this. Let it guide you. What would my life look like if I only spoke when it improved the silence? That doesn't mean walking on eggshells. It means walking with intention. It means owning your voice instead of needing it to be heard at all times. because you don't need to narrate every step of your journey. You just need to take the steps. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not this year, someone will look at your life and say they didn't talk much, but I felt every move they made. That's legacy, that's influence, that's what silence used wisely becomes. And as you close this journey, remember, you don't need to speak to matter. You don't need to shout to lead. You don't need applause to know you're doing the right thing. You just need to live in alignment with your values and let your actions whisper truths too powerful for words. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who might need more calm in their life, not because you're trying to change them, but because you're walking the path first. And if you feel it deeply, drop a single word in the comments. Grounded, no explanation, no long post, just that one word. Let it speak volumes in silence, because that is the Stoic way. We'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, stay still, stay sharp, and speak only when it truly matters.